In this tutorial, I'm going to show you a couple of scripts. We're not doing much coding in this series. I'm not myself much of a computer programmer, and the class I'm teaching doesn't require any previous experience in coding. But we're going to do a couple of very basic things to get this kind of escape room functionality. Most of what we're learning here is coming out of the VR Interaction Toolkit, and we don't have to actually uh, write any scripts to do it. But what I'd like to do is when we walk into this space, I want these doors to appear. I'd like a sound to play. And rather than try to sort of do that with VR interactions, which doesn't exactly make sense, I'm just going to do it by checking if we walked into a collider. So I'll show you how to program this. Don't freak out if you're if you are experienced at programming and you think that the way I'm doing it is silly. Like, oh well, it'll work. And if you're not experienced at programming and you're afraid or intimidated by programming, I'll try to make it as unintimidating as I can. So we're going to make sure we have a folder in our assets called scripts. If you don't have one already, right click, create folder, and make one and call it scripts. And then inside there, we're going to right click and create a C# script. We need to give this a name, and its name is going to be, in my case, I'll call it trap player on enter, something like that. The convention is to not use any spaces and to capitalize each new word. So I did trap player on enter with caps on the new words, and then we double click on it and it should open in either Microsoft Visual Studio or some kind of code editing software associated with your install of Unity. So we've talked about this a little bit before in my tutorials, but if you haven't followed those ones, what you're looking at is basically the using statements are all sort of talking about namespaces, which to my understanding are like a series of already existing pieces of code that we can call. So we don't need to add anything to this. This is just default, and that's cool. Public class trap player on enter, that's the name of what we're writing here. And then inside here, all of these sort of / notes that are marked in green, these are comments. These don't do anything as far as the script is concerned. They just tell us things. So it happens to be informing us that there's two sections of this. There's the start section and the update section. Start is just called once at the beginning, and update is called every frame. I don't actually need either of these though for what I'm going to write, because mine's sort of simpler than that. So I can just select all of that stuff and delete it. And now what I've really got is just like my trap player on enter, and then curly brackets that are marking the beginning and end of my code. So what my goal is here is to check if we have walked into a collider, and then do some stuff if we have. And so we're going to use a piece of code that I believe comes out of the Unity engine, which we're using here, that is called on trigger enter. So here we're going to write private void on trigger enter. And since we are using that namespace, it should recognize that that stuff exists already. And if you want to let it autocomplete for you, you can hit tab and it will. So it is aware of on trigger enter as like a function, and it's looking for a collider. And that collider, we're just going to give a name, other. So that's the other thing that we ran into. And so we're going to check if other dot game object dot tag is player. And that's basically saying I don't care about every collision in the world. I just care about collisions with a thing that is tagged as player. And if it is, then we're going to do something, and that something's going to be contained in more curly brackets. So what we want to do is turn on our doors, just to like make them appear. So to do this, we need to tell our script about the door, that it exists. So what we're going to type is public game object, and then here I'm going to say my door, and then I'm going to put a semicolon after it. So what this means is this is a public variable. It can be accessed like literally in the graphical user interface. We can drag the door into it in the component. So that'll be convenient for us. That's what public means. Game object is we're just looking for a game object, not any special kind. And then my door is going to be its name. And by starting with a lowercase letter in my, we are saying that this is just a variable that we're making up. I'm going to make two of these because there's two doors in my world. So I'm going to make a second one called my door 2. And down here now, these variables exist up in the top inside the first curly bracket. We've named them. And so now I can refer to them down here. So my door, and then it has a function inside of it just by being a game object, and that function happens to be called set active. And then I want to set it true. And then we finish a statement with a semicolon. It's sort of like how in English we finish with a period, but periods do other things in programming, so we're going to finish with a semicolon in this programming language. And we're just going to do the same exact thing with my door 2. So what this we're done for now. What this whole piece of code is doing is it's checking if the collider that this object's collider runs into is the player, and if it is, it's going to set two doors to active. So we can just hit save and go back to Unity, and now this trap player script should exist. If we screwed something up, partly we just forgot to put a semicolon in where we should have or whatever, when it tries to save this, it'll show in your console some errors. Yellow ones you might be able to get by with, but red ones are probably going to stop your game from functioning, and you need to go back in the code editor and find your error. It might be so kind as to tell you which line the problem is on, and if it is, that'll help. Now we need to put this thing on an object, like a component, because basically what we've done is written a component. So I need a collider to collide with. So what I've done is I've made what I'm calling the trap collider, and it's just a big cube that's inside the room. And the way I made this is I just made a cube. I made a 3D object cube. I made it big enough to take up the whole room, and then I just turned off its mesh renderer. So that way I've got a box collider, and then the last step is I set it to isTrigger. And what that does is makes me be able to walk through it, so it's not just like solid and stopping me, but it still collects collision information. So I've got that here pre-built already, my trap collider. And what I'm going to do with it is to add component, and I'll start looking for trap player on enter. I kind of like to find it here in the search thing because it just makes me feel like a real hacker that I wrote something and now it's part of the components list like everything else is. But you can also just click and drag and drop it over here. So now these are those public variables I was trying to describe before. We can just set them by dragging these doors in here. And so what this means is now when our player walks in here, it knows to turn on these doors. So that means that the doors should probably be off from the beginning. And the last thing we need to make sure of is that our rig is tagged player, because that's how we checked. So if you don't know about the idea of a tag in Unity, objects can have tags. And the thing I think we want to tag is not just the complete XR rig, but rather the XR origin, because that's the thing that's going to be moving. And so mine I already have set, but yours probably says untagged in here. You just need to go to the inspector and find tag, which is immediately below the name XR origin. And you pull it down and you choose player, because player is already a tag by default. You can make your own custom tags if you want to, like if you needed to tag something like, lava or whatever, you would just hit add tag and then type in a new tag. But for our purposes, player is going to do it. And that should make the doors appear when we walk in. The last trick that I added to these doors is I gave them, at least one of them, a sound effect, this thing door slam, by adding an audio source component and then choosing door slam as the audio clip. And I made it play on awake. And what that means is as soon as the object that has this audio source on it appears in the game world, it plays this slam sound. Well, we are starting with the doors gone and then just turning the doors on with this piece of code. So the audio source should play right when we turn the doors on. Obviously, a more polished game experience would have a whole animation. The door would like scroll down or something. There would be like a puff of smoke, whatever. For our purposes, we're trying to just successfully lock our player in for now. So I'm going to test this out in our device simulator. And hopefully when I walk in, okay, I've got the doors. Then just as a fun extension of this, you can add more to a script once you've done it. So for example, I have decided not only do I want this to turn on the doors, but I've made these little lights up here that are like indicators. They start off black, but I want them to turn red when the doors are locked and then green when you win and the doors are unlocked. So I'm going to go back to my script and just using the same exact logic, I'm going to add a couple more variables and something else to change. So now I'm going to add a public game object, but this time it's not going to be a door. It's going to be a door signal. And we'll do door signal 1, and I'll do another one called door signal 2. And then the last thing I need, in this case, it'll be slightly different because I'm going to turn these on, so to speak, just by changing their material. So I'm going to do a public material instead of a game object this time. And we'll just name this my material. And the only thing that works a little differently now down here in the if statement is instead of just setting active, we're going to address the door signal, but we're not going to set it active. We're going to get a component, and that component is called the mesh renderer. And the mesh renderer is essentially what makes an object visible. And we're going to look for the mesh renderer's material and change it to my material. So whatever it used to be, now it's going to become this variable my material. And we'll do the same thing again for door signal 2. So now if we hit save, we go back to Unity. It should take a second, recompile the script, And then if we go back to our collider, we have a couple more variables to drag in. So our door signals are these two capsules. And our material is going to be this red glow that I made. So they start off black on their own, and then when we walk in there, they should turn glowing red.